Hi, I'm Zoe Brennan, and I spent 8 Thanksgivings cooking for a family that treated me like unpaid kitchen staff while they lounged in the living room, laughing at jokes I wasn't invited to hear. This year, when Victoria handed me a 20-pound turkey at 6 in the morning with a smile that could freeze hellfire and said, "The guests arrive at 3. Don't embarrass us," I knew something had to change. What she didn't know was that I'd been reviewing environmental impact reports for Sterling Industries all week, and the violations I'd found were about to make her very, very unemployed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thursday mornings in the Brennan household had developed their own cruel rhythm over the past 8 years. The alarm would screech at 5:30, jolting me from whatever restless sleep I'd managed in my childhood bedroom that I still occupied every major holiday, despite having my own apartment 20 minutes away in downtown Portland. Victoria would already be awake, of course, her perfectly straightened auburn hair somehow immune to bedhead, wearing one of her silk robes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She'd glide down the marble staircase of the Lake Oswego house like she was making an entrance at the Met Gala, not preparing for another performance of family dysfunction. The kitchen would be gleaming and cold, all stainless steel appliances and granite countertops that Dad had installed 3 years ago during what Victoria called her domestic goddess phase. That phase had lasted exactly as long as it took for her to realize that owning a dream kitchen didn't mean she actually had to cook in it. Not when she had me. "Good morning, sweetheart," she'd say, the endearment dripping with the kind of false honey that makes your teeth ache. "I've laid out everything you'll need for today." Everything, of course, meant 17 different ingredients for 3 separate side dishes, a turkey that looked like it could feed a small village, and a handwritten list of dietary restrictions for guests I'd never met, but was somehow expected to accommodate. Caleb's girlfriend was apparently gluten-free this month. Lily's debate team coach, who'd been invited for reasons nobody bothered explaining to me, was vegan except for fish, but only on days ending in Y. Victoria's book club friends required appetizers that were Instagram-worthy, but also conversation starters. The worst part wasn't the cooking itself. I'd actually learned to love it during the years right after Mom died, when the kitchen became the only place in the house where I felt useful, where the recipes she'd taught me still lived and breathed. The worst part was the systematic erasure that happened while I chopped and stirred and seasoned. By 7 in the morning, Victoria would have settled into the living room with her first cup of coffee and her laptop, coordinating the day's events by sending group texts about arrival times and seating arrangements to family members who lived in the same house. I was never included in those texts. Dad would emerge around 8, shuffling in his slippers and reading glasses, offering the kind of tepid morning greeting that acknowledged my presence without actually engaging with it. "Smells good already, kiddo," he'd mumble, pouring himself coffee from the pot I'd started before beginning the turkey prep. He'd glance toward the living room where Victoria was holding court with Caleb and Lily, both of them still in pajamas, scrolling through their phones while she read them updates about which cousins were bringing dessert and which uncles were running late. Then he'd disappear upstairs to shower, leaving me alone with the industrial hum of the oven and the distant sound of laughter from people who shared my last name but not my reality. The pattern had solidified so completely over the years that I could predict every. By 10, Victoria would drift back into the kitchen to check on progress, which really meant repositioning serving dishes and critiquing my technique while contributing absolutely nothing to the actual meal preparation. She'd lean against the island with her second cup of coffee, watching me wrestle with pie crusts and timing multiple dishes like she was observing a fascinating anthropological experiment. "You know, Zoe, most girls your age would be so grateful to have this kind of experience," she'd say, gesturing vaguely at the chaos of flour and turkey drippings surrounding me. "Cooking for family builds character. It teaches responsibility." What she never mentioned was that Lily, who was 15 and perfectly capable of learning these same character-building lessons, was upstairs video chatting with friends about Black Friday shopping plans, or that Caleb, 17 and headed to college next year, had never been asked to so much as set a table. The guests would begin arriving around 1, filling the living room with the kind of warm chatter and genuine affection that I could hear but never quite access. Victoria would transform into the perfect hostess, all gracious smiles and thoughtful questions about careers and travel plans and holiday traditions. She'd guide people through the house like a museum docent, pointing out new artwork and sharing carefully curated stories about family life that somehow never included me, despite my being the one ensuring everyone would actually eat that day. When dinner was finally ready, I'd carry dish after dish from the kitchen to the dining room, setting them carefully on the table. Victoria had spent an hour arranging with her grandmother's china and candles that cost more than my grocery budget for a month. The guests would ooh and ah appropriately, complimenting the presentation and the aromas, while Victoria accepted their praise with the modest grace of someone who'd spent the day in meditative contemplation rather than checking emails while someone else did all the work. "Zoe is such a treasure in the kitchen," she'd say. And there it was, the carefully worded acknowledgement that managed to credit me for my labor while positioning herself as the wise matriarch who'd somehow made it all possible. "We're so lucky to have someone who enjoys cooking as much as she does." The word enjoys always landed like a small slap, because it implied choice where there had never been any, and it suggested that my annual kitchen marathon was a hobby rather than an expectation that had calcified into obligation. During dinner, I'd sit at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen so I could jump up for forgotten items or second helpings, listening to conversations about promotion opportunities and vacation plans and the kinds of life updates that people share when they feel truly seen and valued. Victoria would orchestrate the discussion like a conductor, drawing out stories from her book club friends and asking thoughtful questions about Caleb's college applications and Lily's debate tournament. When the conversation occasionally drifted in my direction, it was usually to ask me to pass something or check on dessert timing. The cleanup, of course, was entirely mine. While everyone else moved to the living room for coffee and pie and the kind of lazy post-meal contentment that comes from being well-fed and appreciated, I'd be back in the kitchen scraping plates and loading the dishwasher and hand-washing the delicate serving pieces that couldn't survive the industrial cycle. The laughter from the living room would filter through the walls, a soundtrack to my solitude that made every dirty pot feel heavy. This was the rhythm that had defined my Thanksgiving since Victoria married Dad when I was 21, still raw from losing Mom and naive enough to believe that his new wife's initial kindness was genuine rather than performative. In those early days, she'd actually helped with holiday meals, teaching me her mother's stuffing recipe and complimenting my knife skills while we worked side by side. But as the years passed and her position in the family solidified, her participation diminished until I became the sole proprietor of Holiday Stress while she became its primary beneficiary. What made this particular Thursday morning different wasn't the familiar weight of expectation or the carefully choreographed dance of family dysfunction. It was the manila folder sitting on my desk at the Oregon State Environmental Agency, marked Sterling Industries Compliance Review, containing 47 pages of documentation that could change everything. I'd been assigned to review their environmental impact assessments for 3 major development projects around Portland, routine work that should have been straightforward until I started noticing discrepancies between their reported data and the actual environmental testing results. Victoria had no idea that her stepdaughter, the one she'd been treating like unpaid domestic help for nearly a decade, was the same environmental policy analyst who'd discovered that Sterling Industries had been falsifying water quality reports and understating wetland impact assessments for projects worth millions of dollars. She had no idea that Governor Patricia Walsh, who'd been cracking down on corporate environmental violations as part of her re-election platform, was scheduled to receive my preliminary findings report the Monday after Thanksgiving. As I stood in that cold kitchen at 6 in the morning, staring at a 20-pound turkey and a handwritten list of demands disguised as requests, I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, exactly, though that was certainly there. Not resignation, though I'd carried that weight for years. It was clarity, sharp and sudden, like the moment when you finally understand a puzzle you've been struggling with for hours. I'd spent 8 years trying to earn my place at a table where I was never going to be welcome, cooking meals for people who saw my labor as natural rather than generous, accepting crumbs of acknowledgement while serving feast after feast. But I had something Victoria didn't know about, something that could flip the entire script she'd been writing for our family. For the first time in years, I wasn't just the girl in the kitchen, invisible and expendable. I was the person holding information that could unravel her entire professional life. The turkey sat there like a challenge, 20 pounds of expectation wrapped in plastic and tradition. Victoria's list was written in her precise handwriting, every detail calculated to ensure maximum stress with minimum support. Start the turkey at 7. Appetizers ready by 1. Make sure the good china is spotless. Don't forget to smile when the guests arrive, darling. You represent the family. I picked up the list, read it one more time, and then did something I'd never done before. I folded it carefully, walked over to the granite island where Victoria's laptop sat closed and pristine, and placed the list right next to it where she'd be sure to see it. Then I went upstairs, packed an overnight bag, and left a note on my childhood desk that read simply, "Gone to Tasha's for the holiday. The turkey's in the fridge. Good luck." What I didn't write in that note was that I'd already made copies of every single Sterling Industries document in my case file. What I didn't mention was that Governor Walsh's direct phone number was saved in my contacts, along with the cell number of Marcus Hartwell, CEO of Sterling Industries. What Victoria would discover over the next few days was that her years of treating me like invisible help had been her biggest strategic error, because invisible people see everything, and sometimes they have the power to make what they've seen matter. The drive to Tasha's apartment took me through downtown Portland, past the gleaming towers where Victoria conducted her business meetings, and made the deals that had built her reputation as one of the city's most successful development executives. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent years feeling small and insignificant in her presence while working in a building just 6 blocks from her office, reviewing the very projects that had made her career possible. Tash answered her door in pajamas and confusion, holding a cup of coffee and squinting at me like I was a mirage. "Zoe, what are you doing here? Isn't today your annual kitchen marathon?" She'd been my best friend since college, the one person who'd witnessed every holiday meltdown and every tearful phone call about feeling invisible in my own family. She'd offered to let me spend Thanksgiving with her and her girlfriend Carmen for years, but I'd always felt obligated to maintain the fiction that the Brennan family holiday was something worth preserving. "Change of plans," I said, holding up my overnight bag. The look of pure joy that crossed her face was worth every moment of anxiety churning in my stomach. "Finally," she said, pulling me into her apartment. "Carmen is going to lose her mind. She's been betting that you'd eventually realize Victoria is a sociopath in designer clothes." What Tash didn't know yet was that my rebellion was about to become significantly more complicated than simply skipping one family dinner. What none of them knew was that I'd spent the past 2 weeks documenting environmental violations that could cost Sterling Industries millions in fines and potentially tank Victoria's career entirely. The girl who'd been invisible for 8 years was about to become very, very visible, and the consequences were going to ripple far beyond one ruined Thanksgiving. As I settled into Tasha's guest room and listened to Carmen start cooking what she called Liberation Turkey in my honor, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Governor Walsh's contact information. Monday morning was still 3 days away, but something told me that this weekend was going to change everything, not just for me but for Victoria, for Sterling Industries, and for every family dinner that would never quite be the same again. The turkey I'd left in the Lake Oswego kitchen was still sitting in its packaging, a 20-pound symbol of expectations I was no longer willing to carry, but the real feast was just beginning, and for the first time in 8 years I was going to be the one setting the table. The manila folder had been sitting on my desk for 3 weeks before I understood what I was really looking at. At first it seemed like routine bureaucratic paperwork, the kind of environmental compliance review that crossed my desk monthly at the Oregon State Environmental Agency. Sterling Industries was applying for permits on 3 major development projects around Portland, and as the lead analyst for wetland and water quality assessments, it was my job to verify that their environmental impact studies met state standards. I remember the exact moment everything clicked into place. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early November, the kind of gray Pacific Northwest day where the rain feels more like a gentle conspiracy than actual weather. I'd been cross-referencing Sterling's water quality data with independent testing results from the Department of Environmental Quality when the numbers simply didn't match. Not close enough to be measurement error, not different enough to be explained by seasonal variation. They were wrong in a way that suggested deliberate manipulation. The first red flag was the dissolved oxygen levels in Tualatin Creek where Sterling planned to build a luxury residential complex. Their report showed consistently healthy readings over a 6-month period. exactly what you'd expect from pristine waterway capable of supporting salmon runs and native fish populations. But the DEQ's independent testing from the same time period painted a drastically different picture. The creek was struggling, with oxygen levels dropping to dangerous lows during summer months and nitrogen contamination, suggesting runoff from industrial sources upstream. I pulled up Sterling's methodology section, expecting to find some explanation for the discrepancy. Maybe they'd tested during different weather conditions, or used equipment with different calibrations, or sampled from slightly different locations along the creek. What I found instead was a detailed description of testing procedures that matched DEQ protocols exactly, which meant either their equipment was catastrophically malfunctioning, or someone was falsifying data. The second project raised even more questions. Sterling wanted to convert a 100-acre parcel near Beaverton into mixed-use commercial space, complete with shopping centers and office buildings. Their wetland delineation report claimed the property contained only 12 acres of protected wetland areas, mostly seasonal drainage ditches that wouldn't qualify for federal protection. But satellite imagery from the past 5 years told a different story. The property clearly contained year-round wetlands with established vegetation patterns and wildlife habitats that should have been flagged as environmentally sensitive. I spent the next week diving deeper into Sterling's environmental assessments, comparing their findings with historical data, independent surveys, and even amateur naturalist reports from local hiking groups. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Sterling Industries wasn't just cutting corners on environmental compliance, they were systematically misrepresenting ecological conditions to avoid costly mitigation requirements and lengthy permit processes. The third project was the smoking gun. Sterling proposed building a conference center and hotel complex on property adjacent to Powell Butte Nature Park, one of Portland's most treasured green spaces. Their soil contamination analysis showed clean results across the entire site, with no trace of industrial pollutants or hazardous materials. But I remembered reading about that property in graduate school, when I was researching the environmental legacy of Portland's industrial past. The site had housed a chemical processing plant from the 1940s through the 1980s, with documented cases of soil and groundwater contamination that had taken decades to remediate. I pulled the historical environmental assessments from our archives, documents that Sterling should have referenced in their impact study. The contamination was still there, layers of industrial chemicals that had leached deep into the soil and would require expensive cleanup before any construction could safely begin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sterling's report didn't mention any of this history, describing the site as if it had been pristine farmland for the past century. That's when I realized what I was really looking at. This wasn't sloppy research or innocent oversight. Sterling Industries was deliberately falsifying environmental data to fast-track development projects that would otherwise face years of regulatory review and millions of dollars in environmental remediation costs. They were gambling that state reviewers would accept their assessments at face value, that nobody would bother to cross-reference their claims with independent data, that the regulatory system would rubber stamp their applications based on fraudulent documentation. What they hadn't counted on was having their permit applications land on the desk of someone whose stepmother happened to be Victoria Sterling, Senior Vice President of Development at Sterling Industries and the public face of their environmental compliance efforts. Someone who'd spent years listening to Victoria brag about her company's commitment to sustainable development and responsible environmental stewardship. Someone who'd been treated like invisible help while Victoria built her reputation on projects that were apparently built on lies. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt orchestrated by the universe. Victoria had spent 8 years making me feel like I didn't matter, like my opinions and feelings and very existence were optional inconveniences to be managed around rather than engaged with. She'd positioned herself as the successful professional while treating me like an extension of the kitchen appliances, useful when needed, but otherwise ignorable. She had no idea that her stepdaughter, the one she'd never bothered to ask about her actual job, was the person responsible for reviewing the environmental compliance of every major development project in the Portland metropolitan area. I sat in my cubicle on that gray Tuesday afternoon, staring at 47 pages of fraudulent documentation, and felt something shift in my understanding of power dynamics. For years I'd believed that Victoria held all the cards in our relationship. She had Dad's attention, she controlled the family social calendar, she set the tone for holiday gatherings and family functions. She lived in the big house with the perfect kitchen while I rented a one-bedroom apartment downtown. She drove luxury cars and wore designer clothes and attended charity galas while I clipped coupons and bought generic brand groceries. But Victoria's success, her reputation, her entire professional identity was built on projects that violated environmental law. And I was the one person in Oregon state government with both the expertise to recognize the violations and the authority to do something about them. The invisible stepdaughter who'd been cooking Thanksgiving dinner alone while the family laughed in the next room was also the environmental analyst who could recommend criminal charges against Sterling Industries for environmental fraud. I made copies of everything that afternoon, following protocols I'd learned during my first week on the job 3 years earlier. Official copies went into the case file that would eventually reach Governor Walsh's desk. Unofficial copies went into my personal files, carefully organized and cross-referenced with supporting documentation from independent sources. I wasn't planning anything dramatic at that point, wasn't thinking about revenge, or confrontation, or public exposure. I was just doing my job, following the evidence where it led, documenting violations that could impact Portland's environmental future for decades. But as I drove home that evening, passing the gleaming Sterling Industries building where Victoria was probably working late on another fraudulent environmental assessment, I couldn't help imagining her reaction when she discovered that her disposable stepdaughter was the person who could unravel her entire career. The thought made me smile for the first time in weeks. The next few days fell into their familiar rhythm. I continued my analysis of Sterling's environmental fraud, building a case file that grew thicker each day as I uncovered new discrepancies and documented additional violations. Victoria continued her usual pattern of benign neglect, mixed with holiday preparation stress, leaving voicemails about Thanksgiving logistics and dietary restrictions for guests I'd never met, but was expected to accommodate without question. The disconnect between these two realities was surreal. Victoria would call my office landline, not bothering to try my cell phone first, leaving messages about turkey timing and appetizer expectations in the same cheerful tone she used for everything else. Meanwhile, I was documenting environmental crimes that could result in federal charges, millions in fines, and the complete destruction of Sterling Industries' reputation as a responsible development company. Thursday morning arrived with its familiar weight of obligation and dread. I set my alarm for 5:30, drove to Lake Oswego in the pre-dawn darkness, and let myself into the house with the key I'd been carrying since high school. Victoria was already awake, of course, orchestrating the day's events from the living room, while I unpacked groceries and began prep work on what would become my final performance as the invisible kitchen help. The turkey seemed heavier than usual that morning, 20 pounds of expectation and tradition that I suddenly couldn't bear to lift. Victoria's handwritten list of demands felt like a contract I'd never actually agreed to sign, full of obligations that had been imposed rather than requested. The kitchen, with its gleaming appliances and perfect lighting, felt less like a workspace and more like a stage where I'd been performing the same character for 8 years without ever being given a script or understanding the plot. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Not dramatically, not with any grand gesture or angry confrontation. I simply folded Victoria's list, placed it next to her laptop where she'd be sure to find it, and walked upstairs to pack an overnight bag. The note I left on my childhood desk was brief and final. Gone to Tasha's for the holiday, the turkey's in the fridge, good luck. What I didn't write in that note was that Monday morning, Governor Walsh would receive a comprehensive report documenting Sterling Industries' environmental fraud. What I didn't mention was that I'd already prepared a detailed briefing for the State Attorney General's office, complete with recommendations for criminal prosecution. What Victoria would discover over the next 72 hours was that her years of treating me like unpaid domestic help had been the biggest strategic miscalculation of her professional life. The drive to Tasha's apartment took me through downtown Portland, past the Sterling Industries building where Victoria's corner office looked out over the city she was systematically polluting through fraudulent environmental assessment. I thought about all the dinner conversations where she'd bragged about Sterling's commitment to sustainable development, how they were setting new standards for environmental responsibility in the construction industry. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, even for someone who'd learned to expect duplicity from Victoria in personal matters. Tash opened her door with the kind of shocked joy usually reserved for surprise birthday parties or unexpected lottery winning. She'd been encouraging me to skip family holidays for years, offering her guest room every Thanksgiving and Christmas while watching me torture myself with obligations that were never reciprocated. Her girlfriend Carmen emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron that read, "Grateful, thankful, blessed," in glittery letters, took one look at my overnight bag, and started crying happy tears. "I need to tell you something," I said once we'd settled in their living room with coffee and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from friendships forged in graduate school stress and maintained through years of adult disappointment. "This isn't just about skipping dinner. Things are about to get complicated." I told them everything: the environmental fraud, the falsified reports, the systematic violations that could destroy Sterling Industries and potentially send Victoria to federal prison. I explained how my routine permit review had uncovered crimes that could impact Portland's environmental future for generations, how the stepmother who'd been treating me like invisible help for 8 years was about to discover that invisible people sometimes have the power to change everything. Tash listened with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for her own research, occasionally asking clarifying questions about environmental law and regulatory procedure. Carmen, who worked in public relations for a nonprofit focused on environmental justice, understood the implications immediately. "This is huge," she said quietly. "Like career-ending, company-destroying huge. Does Victoria have any idea what you do for work?" That question hit me like a physical blow, because the answer revealed just how completely Victoria had dismissed my existence. We'd been family for 8 years, living in the same house for major holidays, sharing hundreds of dinners and family gatherings, and she'd never once asked about my actual job responsibility. She knew I worked for the state government, but she'd never bothered to learn which department or what my specific role entailed. In her mind, I was apparently the girl who cooked holiday meals and occasionally showed up for family photos, not someone whose professional expertise could impact her career. "She has no idea," I said, and the words felt strange in my mouth. "She's never asked what I actually do at work. She knows I have a job with the state, but she's never asked for details. Never asked about my projects or my responsibilities, or whether I like what I do." In 8 years, the silence that followed was heavy with implication. Tash and Carmen exchanged one of those married couple looks that contain entire conversations. Then Carmen leaned forward with the kind of intensity that made her legendary in activist circles. "So she's been systematically devaluing you personally while committing crimes that fall directly under your professional jurisdiction, and she has no idea that these two things are connected." "Pretty much. That," said Tash with grim satisfaction, "is what we call poetic justice." We spent the rest of Thursday afternoon cooking what Carmen declared liberation turkey, while I explained the details of environmental compliance law and the potential consequences Victoria was facing. The violations I documented weren't minor procedural oversights that could be corrected with additional paperwork and modest fines. They were deliberate falsifications of environmental data that could result in federal charges for environmental fraud, conspiracy, and potentially racketeering, if prosecutors could prove the fraud was systematic across multiple projects. The governor's been making environmental protection a centerpiece of her re-election campaign, I explained while Carmen taught me her grandmother's stuffing recipe and Tash documented everything with her phone camera for posterity. She's specifically targeting corporate environmental fraud as part of her platform. She's promised to pursue criminal charges against companies that falsify environmental data, not just civil penalty. And Sterling Industries just handed her the perfect test case, Carmen said, grinning while she basted the turkey. "With your stepmother as the public face of their environmental compliance program." The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Victoria had spent years positioning herself as Sterling's environmental conscience, the executive who ensured their projects met the highest standards of ecological responsibility. She gave interviews to local business journals about sustainable development practices. She spoke at conferences about corporate environmental stewardship. She'd even been featured in Portland Monthly magazine as one of the city's green business leaders, photographed in her corner office with awards from environmental groups decorating the walls behind her. All of that carefully constructed public image was built on systematic environmental fraud that I could prove with documentation spanning 3 years and multiple projects. When Governor Walsh received my report on Monday morning, Victoria wouldn't just be facing professional consequences. She'd be facing potential federal criminal charges that could result in prison time and the complete destruction of her reputation. That evening, while we watched old movies and ate Carmen's legendary pecan pie, my phone started buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from the Lake Oswego house. First came a text from Dad around 6. "Where are you?" Victoria's asking about dinner timing. Then a voicemail from Victoria herself at 7, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Zoe, I need you to call me immediately. We have guests arriving, and the turkey isn't ready, and I don't understand your timeline." The messages escalated throughout the evening. By 9 o'clock, Victoria was calling every hour, her carefully controlled composure cracking with each voicemail. "This is completely unacceptable behavior," she said in one message. "You've embarrassed the entire family. People are asking where you are and I don't know what to tell them." By 11, her tone had shifted to something approaching desperation. "Please call me back. We need to discuss this situation before Monday morning." That last message made me pause the movie and look at my phone more carefully. Why Monday morning specifically? What did Victoria think was happening on Monday that required discussion? As far as she knew, I'd simply skipped one family dinner. Hardly the kind of crisis that required weekend emergency meetings, unless she somehow knew about the Sterling Industries investigation. I shared this thought with Tash and Carmen, who agreed that Victoria's reference to Monday morning seemed oddly specific. We spent the next hour brainstorming possible explanations. Maybe someone at Sterling had heard rumors about environmental compliance review. Maybe Victoria had connections in state government who'd warned her about potential investigations. Maybe the timing was just coincidental anxiety about returning to work after a holiday weekend. But something in Victoria's voice during that final message suggested she knew her professional life was about to become very complicated, even if she couldn't yet connect those complications to her missing stepdaughter. The woman who'd spent 8 years treating me like disposable kitchen help was suddenly very interested in my whereabouts and availability for urgent conversations. The weekend passed in a strange bubble of anticipation and normalcy. Carmen made spectacular leftover turkey sandwiches while Tash grilled me about my plans for Monday morning. I'd already scheduled a meeting with Governor Walsh's chief of staff for 9 o'clock, a routine briefing that would become significantly less routine once I presented my findings about Sterling Industries. I'd prepared a comprehensive report with supporting documentation, legal analysis, and recommendations for criminal prosecution that could be implemented immediately. What I hadn't prepared for was the possibility that Victoria might somehow discover my role in her impending professional destruction before Monday morning arrived. What I hadn't considered was that her years of treating me like invisible help might have been strategic blindness rather than simple neglect, and that she might be more aware of my professional capabilities than she'd ever let on. Sunday evening, as I prepared to return to my own apartment and mentally rehearsed my presentation for Governor Walsh's office, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another telemarketer or political survey, but something made me swipe to accept the call. "Zoe?" The voice was unfamiliar but urgent, a woman who sounded like she was calling from inside a car with the windows down. "This is Janet Morrison from Channel 8 News. I understand you have information about environmental violations at Sterling Industries. Would you be available for an interview this evening?" I hung up immediately, my hands shaking as I stared at the phone screen. How had a news reporter gotten my personal phone number? How did she know about the Sterling Industries investigation that wasn't supposed to become public until after Governor Walsh reviewed my findings? How had my carefully planned professional disclosure turned into a media circus before I'd even filed my official report? The answer came 10 minutes later when Tash's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Tell your friend Zoe that Victoria Sterling says hi. Attached was a photo of Sterling Industries letterhead, and what appeared to be the first page of my confidential environmental assessment, marked with official state seals and dated for Monday morning's delivery to the governor's office. Victoria had somehow obtained copies of my investigation before I'd even filed it officially. The invisible stepdaughter who'd been cooking Thanksgiving dinner alone while the family laughed in the next room was about to discover that some battles aren't won in kitchens or courtrooms, but in the space between what people think they know and what they can actually prove. The photograph on my phone screen felt like looking through a window into an alternate reality where my worst fears had materialized overnight. There was my confidential environmental assessment report, the one I'd locked in my office desk drawer Friday afternoon, photographed against Sterling Industries letterhead like some kind of corporate trophy. The image quality was sharp enough to read my name in the header and clear enough to see the official state seal that marked it as classified until formal review. My hands were trembling as I forwarded the image to Tash, who was in her kitchen making Sunday evening tea and humming something that sounded like a victory song. The humming stopped abruptly when her phone chimed, followed by a string of creative profanity that would have impressed longshoremen and graduate students alike. "How the hell did she get that?" Tash demanded, storming into the living room with her phone held out like evidence in a criminal trial. Carmen looked up from her crossword puzzle, took one glance at the image, and immediately started pacing in the way that meant her public relations instincts had kicked into overdrive. "Someone inside the state government gave her access," I said, though saying it out loud made the reality feel even more impossible. "That document was locked in my desk. The only other copies are in the case file system that requires supervisor approval to access. Either someone broke into my office over the weekend, or Victoria has connections inside the environmental agency that I don't know about." The implications were staggering. If Victoria had been monitoring environmental compliance reviews related to Sterling Industries, she would have known for weeks that her company was under investigation. She might have known before Thanksgiving that her stepdaughter was the analyst responsible for documenting their environmental fraud, which meant her behavior during the holiday preparation, her insistence on maintaining family traditions, her increasing desperation when I disappeared Thursday morning, might have been calculated performance rather than genuine family dysfunction. Carmen stopped pacing and turned to face me with the kind of intense focus that made her legendary in crisis management. "We need to assume that Victoria knows everything. Your job title, your responsibilities, the scope of your investigation, probably even your meeting schedule for Monday morning. The question is what she plans to do with that information." The answer came faster than I expected. My phone rang again, same unknown number that had connected me to the Channel 8 reporter 20 minutes earlier. This time I answered immediately, putting the call on speaker so Tash and Carmen could hear whatever fresh nightmare was about to unfold. "Zoe, this is Victoria." Her voice had the kind of artificial calm that meant she was furious but trying to sound reasonable for strategic purpose. "I think we need to have a conversation before you do something you'll regret for the rest of your career." "How did you get this number?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be more disturbing than enlightening. "I've had your personal information for years, sweetheart. Emergency contact forms, insurance paperwork, family cell phone plan details. You forget that I handle administrative matters for your father's household." The endearment landed like a threat, sugary sweet, and completely hollow. What I didn't realize until this weekend is that my stepdaughter has been conducting a vendetta investigation against my company while pretending to be family. The accusation was so backwards, so perfectly inverted from reality, that I actually laughed. "Vendetta investigation." "Victoria, I was assigned to review Sterling Industries' environmental compliance as part of my normal job responsibilities. I didn't ask for the assignment, and I didn't know about your connection to the company until I'd already documented multiple violations." "That's an interesting story," she said, and I could hear her moving around what sounded like an office environment, papers shuffling and keyboards clicking in the background. "But it's going to be difficult to maintain when people find out that you've been living in our house for major holidays, eating meals I paid for, benefiting from family resources while secretly building a case against the company that provides those resources." The twisted logic was breathtaking in its audacity. Victoria was trying to reframe 8 years of treating me like unpaid domestic help as somehow benefiting me financially, positioning her systematic exclusion and emotional neglect as generous family support that I'd betrayed through professional obligations I'd never chosen. I was assigned to review your company's environmental compliance because that's my job, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I documented violations because violations exist. Your company falsified environmental data on multiple projects over several years. Those are facts, not vendetta. Facts can be interpreted many different ways, Victoria replied smoothly. For example, it's a fact that you've been emotionally unstable since your mother's death, requiring constant family support and accommodation. It's a fact that you've expressed resentment about family holiday arrangements for years. It's a fact that you disappeared from Thanksgiving dinner after learning about my position at Sterling Industries, suggesting premeditation rather than professional objectivity. Each word felt like a chess move in a game I'd never agreed to play, strategic repositioning designed to undermine my credibility before I could present my findings to Governor Walsh. Victoria was building a narrative where my environmental investigation became personal revenge, disguised as professional duty, where my years of family service became evidence of instability and resentment rather than genuine contribution. The violations are documented with independent data sources, I said, glancing at Tash and Carmen for moral support. Water quality testing, soil contamination analysis, wetland delineation surveys. None of that can be explained away by personal grudges or family dynamics. Independent data sources that you selected, analyzed and interpreted while living under my roof and harboring personal resentment, Victoria countered. Environmental compliance review involves significant subjective judgment. When that judgment is compromised by personal bias, the entire investigation becomes questionable. The sophistication of her strategy was terrifying. Victoria wasn't denying the environmental violations or claiming that Sterling Industries had followed proper procedure. She was attacking my credibility as an investigator, suggesting that personal bias had corrupted my professional analysis in ways that would make my findings inadmissible in legal proceedings and unreliable for regulatory decision-making. What do you want, Victoria? I asked, cutting through her carefully constructed argument to the practical reality underneath. You called me for a reason. What's your endgame here? The silence stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then Victoria's voice returned with a different quality, more businesslike, and less artificially sweet. I want you to withdraw your report before it reaches Governor Walsh tomorrow morning. File an amended assessment that acknowledges data interpretation limitations and recommends additional study, rather than immediate sanctions. Sterling Industries will voluntarily implement enhanced environmental monitoring for future projects, and if I refuse, then Tuesday morning, every major news outlet in Portland will receive a comprehensive dossier documenting your history of mental health issues, family conflict, and personal grudges against Sterling Industries. Your colleagues at the Environmental Agency will learn about your unstable behavior during family gatherings and your pattern of resentment towards successful family members. Governor Walsh will discover that her star environmental analyst has been conducting personal vendettas under the guise of professional objectivity. The threat was so precisely calibrated, so perfectly designed to destroy my professional reputation while leaving Victoria's corporate image intact, that I had to admire its cruel efficiency. She'd identified exactly how to frame my legitimate environmental investigation as compromised personal revenge, using my years of family exclusion as evidence of bias, rather than acknowledging it as evidence of her own character defect. You're blackmailing me, I said, wanting the words on record even though I knew Victoria was probably recording the conversation for her own strategic purposes. I'm offering you an opportunity to correct a mistake before it damages both our careers, she replied smoothly. Your choice, Zoe. Professional integrity or personal destruction. You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to decide. The call ended with a sharp click that felt like a door slamming, leaving me staring at my phone screen while Tash and Carmen processed what we'd just heard. The living room felt smaller somehow, as if Victoria's voice had brought the walls closer together and made the air harder to breathe. She's been planning this, Carmen said finally, her public relations expertise kicking into analytical mode. This wasn't improvised damage control. She's had a strategy for dealing with environmental investigations, probably for months, maybe years, which means she knew the violations existed, Tash added, pacing between the kitchen and living room like a caged academic. She knew Sterling Industries was falsifying environmental data, and she prepared for the possibility that someone would eventually discover it. The question is how many other investigations she's derailed using similar tactics. The implications were staggering. If Victoria had been systematically undermining environmental compliance reviews through personal attacks on investigators, Sterling Industries might have been violating environmental law for years, while avoiding meaningful consequences. My investigation might be just one example of regulatory oversight that had been neutralized through character assassination and professional intimidation. We need to document everything, I said, suddenly understanding that this conversation represented evidence of obstruction of justice and potential witness intimidation. Record keeping, timeline documentation, evidence preservation. If Victoria is trying to obstruct my investigation through personal threats, that's a federal crime on top of the environmental violations. Carmen was already pulling out her laptop, opening documents and starting what looked like a comprehensive crisis management plan. We need to get ahead of her narrative, she said, typing rapidly while talking. She's going to frame you as an unstable family member conducting personal revenge. We need to frame her as a corporate executive, attempting to obstruct environmental compliance through intimidation and character assassination. The problem is that she has resources I don't, I said, realizing for the first time how comprehensively Victoria had positioned herself for this kind of conflict. Sterling Industries has a legal department, a public relations team, probably crisis management consultants who specialize in environmental scandals. I have a state government salary and a friend who works for an environmental nonprofit. You also have 47 pages of documented environmental violations, and a conversation where Victoria just threatened to destroy your career if you don't withdraw your investigation, Tash pointed out. That's not exactly a weak position. But as we spent the next hour strategizing responses and preparing documentation, I couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria had been playing a longer game than any of us understood. Her threat to expose my mental health issues and family conflict suggested she'd been building a file on my personal life for years, collecting ammunition for exactly this kind of scenario. Her confidence about manipulating media coverage implied connections and resources that went far beyond Sterling Industries' normal business operations. The most disturbing possibility was that my Thanksgiving rebellion hadn't been the spontaneous act of independence I'd thought it was. If Victoria had known about my environmental investigation for weeks, my dramatic exit from holiday dinner preparation might have been exactly what she wanted, providing evidence of instability and personal resentment that would support her narrative about biased investigation and compromised professional judgment. She played me, I said, suddenly, the realization hitting like cold water. The whole Thanksgiving setup, the impossible demands, the systematic exclusion from family events. She wasn't just being cruel for entertainment, she was building a case that I'm emotionally unstable and resentful of family success. Carmen looked up from her laptop with the kind of grim recognition that meant she'd reached the same conclusion. Every holiday dinner where you cooked alone while they celebrated in the next room, every family photo where you were excluded, every social event where you weren't invited. She was documenting a pattern of family rejection that she could later claim drove you to professional revenge. 8 years of evidence that you're an outsider in your own family, Tash added quietly. 8 years of behavior that she can now present as proof that you harbor personal grudges against successful family members. The strategic sophistication was breathtaking and horrifying. Victoria hadn't just been neglecting me or excluding me from family life out of casual cruelty. She'd been systematically creating conditions that would support a narrative of personal bias and professional compromise if I ever became a threat to her business interests. Every ignored birthday, every excluded holiday gathering, every dismissive comment about my career had been building toward this moment when she could weaponize my family exclusion against my professional credibility. But here's what she didn't account for, Carmen said, closing her laptop and turning to face me with the kind of determined smile that had made her legendary in activist circles. She assumed you'd be isolated when this moment came. She planned for you to be alone, vulnerable, dependent on family relationships you couldn't afford to lose. Instead, you have documentation, witnesses, and allies who've been watching her systematic abuse for years. Tash continued, understanding immediately where Carmen was heading. You have friends who can testify about her treatment of you, records of your professional competence, and evidence that her threats represent obstruction of justice rather than legitimate family concern. Plus, Carmen added with growing excitement, she just made a catastrophic strategic error. Instead of quietly managing the environmental and investigation through normal corporate channels, she revealed that she's been monitoring state government reviews and attempting to intimidate investigators. That transforms this from a routine compliance issue into a federal obstruction case. Sunday evening faded into Monday morning preparation. We worked to build a comprehensive response strategy that would present Victoria's threats as evidence of guilt, rather than allowing her to frame my investigation as evidence of bias. Carmen drafted press releases and media talking points while Tash compiled character references and professional recommendations. I organized my environmental documentation and prepared additional evidence of Victoria's attempt to obstruct the investigation. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that Victoria's years of treating me like invisible kitchen help had created exactly the conditions that would support my credibility against her corporate power. Every friend who'd witnessed holiday dinners where I cooked alone, every colleague who'd seen my professional competence, every neighbor who'd watched her systematic exclusion of me from family life, now represented potential testimony about her character and my reliability. By 3 a.m, we had a plan that felt solid enough to present to Governor Walsh and comprehensive enough to counter Victoria's anticipated character assassination. What we didn't have was any certainty about what resources Victoria might deploy in the next 6 hours, or what other strategic advantages she'd been building during the years when I thought she was simply being cruel for its own sake. As I tried to catch a few hours of sleep before the most important meeting of my professional life, I couldn't stop thinking about the 20-pound turkey still sitting in the Lake Oswego refrigerator, a symbol of expectations I'd finally stopped carrying. Tomorrow morning, Victoria would discover whether 8 years of systematic family exclusion had been strategic preparation for this moment, or the biggest miscalculation of her corporate career. The battle lines were drawn, the documentation was prepared, and the consequences were about to ripple far beyond one ruined holiday dinner. But for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't facing the conflict alone, and I wasn't carrying expectations that belonged to someone else. Victoria had taught me to be invisible, but she'd forgotten that invisible people see everything, and sometimes they have the power to make what they've seen matter in ways that change everything. The alarm was set for 7:30, giving me enough time to review my presentation one final time before walking into Governor Walsh's office with evidence that could destroy Sterling Industries and potentially send Victoria to federal prison. Whether her years of strategic cruelty would protect her corporate interests or provide the final proof of her character defects was about to be decided by people with the power to make those decisions matter. The Oregon State Capitol building rose against the Monday morning sky like a monument to the kind of civic idealism that I'd believed in when I first started working for the environmental agency 3 years ago. The neoclassical columns and gleaming dome represented the promise that institutions could protect public interests against corporate malfeasance, that individual civil servants could make meaningful differences in policy outcomes that affected thousands of people. As I climbed the marble steps toward Governor Walsh's office, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that could topple one of Portland's most prominent development companies, I wondered if that idealism was about to be tested beyond its breaking point. The security checkpoint felt more intense than usual, with guards who seemed unusually focused on identification verification and appointment confirmation. My meeting with Governor Walsh's chief of staff had been scheduled for weeks, a routine briefing on environmental compliance reviews that happened quarterly as part of the administration's transparency initiative. But something about the atmosphere suggested that my routine briefing had become significantly less routine since Friday afternoon. Governor Walsh's outer office buzzed with the kind of controlled energy that meant important decisions were being made behind closed doors and carefully managed leaks were being strategically deployed to favored media outlets. Staffers moved between offices with the purposeful urgency of people coordinating complex political operations, and multiple phones seemed to be ringing simultaneously with calls that were answered in hushed tones and transferred immediately to senior advisor. Margaret Chen, the governor's chief of staff, emerged from the inner office precisely at 9 o'clock with the kind of professionally neutral expression that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. She'd been a federal prosecutor before joining Governor Walsh's administration, bringing expertise in environmental law and corporate criminal defense that had made her legendary in regulatory circles for her ability to navigate complex cases involving both technical violations and political implications. "Brennan," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip that felt more like an assessment than a greeting. "Thank you for coming in this morning. The governor is very interested in your environmental compliance findings, particularly those related to Sterling Industries." The phrasing made me pause halfway through returning her handshake. Governor Walsh was interested in my findings specifically related to Sterling Industries, not in my quarterly briefing on environmental compliance generally, which meant someone had already briefed her on the content of my investigation before I'd arrived to present it myself. Someone had prepared her for exactly what violations I'd documented and exactly which company was involved. "Has someone else already provided information about my Sterling Industries review?" I asked, following Margaret through a corridor lined with official portraits of previous Oregon governors and plaques commemorating legislative achievements in environmental protection. "Let's discuss that in the governor's office," Margaret replied diplomatically, which was lawyer speak for yes, but it's complicated, and we need to control the context in which you learn how complicated it's become. Governor Walsh's private office felt like a carefully curated museum of environmental advocacy, with framed photographs of protected wilderness areas covering one wall and awards from conservation organizations displayed on polished wood shelves that probably cost more than my annual rent. Patricia Walsh herself sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of Oregon oak, reviewing documents with the kind of focused intensity that had made her famous for mastering complex policy details that most politicians delegated to staff members. She looked up as we entered, her expression shifting from administrative concentration to something that felt more like strategic evaluation. Governor Walsh had built her political career on environmental protection issues, transforming from a relatively unknown state legislator into a nationally recognized advocate for corporate accountability and environmental compliance. Her re-election campaign had made environmental justice a centerpiece issue, promising aggressive prosecution of companies that violated environmental regulations and systematic reform of oversight processes that had allowed corporate malfeasance to continue unchecked for decades. "Ms. Brennan," she said, gesturing toward a chair positioned directly across from her desk, "I understand you have important information about environmental violations at Sterling Industries. Before we discuss your findings, I need to make you aware of some developments that occurred over the weekend." Margaret Chen took a seat beside me, opening a folder that looked suspiciously thick for a routine quarterly briefing. "Saturday evening, our office received a comprehensive report about your personal relationship with Victoria Sterling, Senior Vice President of Development at Sterling Industries. The report alleges that you've been conducting a biased investigation motivated by family conflicts rather than professional environmental compliance review." The words hit like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting exactly this strategy since Victoria's phone call Sunday evening. Hearing it articulated in the governor's office, presented as official information that required institutional response, made the personal attack feel more real and more dangerous than it had during our late-night strategy sessions at Tash's apartment. The report includes detailed documentation of family gatherings where you allegedly expressed resentment about Miss Sterling's professional success. Margaret continued, consulting her notes with the clinical precision of someone reading medical diagnosis results. "It describes a pattern of emotional instability and personal grudges that allegedly compromise your objectivity in reviewing Sterling Industries' environmental compliance." Governor Walsh leaned forward slightly, her expression remaining neutral but her attention sharpening in a way that suggested she was evaluating my response for signs of the instability Victoria had alleged. The allegations are serious, Ms. Brennan. If accurate, they would raise significant questions about the validity of your environmental assessment and the integrity of our compliance review process. The allegations are false, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Victoria Sterling is my stepmother, but I was assigned to review Sterling Industries without any knowledge of her connection to the company. I documented environmental violations because violations exist, not because of personal grievances. That's your perspective, Margaret said carefully. But we also received supporting documentation that appears to corroborate some aspects of the family conflict allegation. Photographs from family gatherings where you appear isolated or excluded. Text message exchanges suggesting ongoing tension about holiday arrangements. Witness statements from family members describing concerning behavior patterns. The sophistication of Victoria's attack was staggering. She hadn't just thrown together accusations and hoped they would stick. She'd prepared a comprehensive case file that included photographic evidence, communication records, and witness testimony designed to support her narrative about my alleged bias and instability. She'd weaponized 8 years of family dysfunction as evidence against my professional credibility. May I present my environmental findings before we discuss personal allegations? I asked, opening my briefcase and removing the 47-page report that had consumed weeks of analysis and documentation. The violations I documented are supported by independent data sources and verified through multiple testing methodologies. They exist regardless of any family relationships or personal dynamics. Governor Walsh exchanged a glance with Margaret Chen that contained layers of communication I couldn't fully decode, then nodded toward my report. Please proceed with your presentation. We'll evaluate the environmental evidence alongside the personal allegations and determine appropriate next steps. I spent the next 30 minutes walking through Sterling Industries' systematic environmental fraud, presenting water quality data that had been falsified, wetland assessments that had been deliberately misrepresented, and soil contamination reports that had ignored decades of documented industrial pollution. I showed satellite imagery that contradicted Sterling's claims about ecological impact, independent testing results that exposed their fraudulent data, and historical environmental assessments that they had completely omitted from their permit application. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Sterling Industries had committed multiple federal environmental crimes across several years and multiple projects, violating laws designed to protect Portland's water supply, wetland ecosystems, and public health. The violations weren't minor technical oversights that could be corrected with additional paperwork and modest fines. They were systematic falsifications that could result in environmental damage lasting decades and criminal charges that could send corporate executives to federal prison. This is comprehensive documentation, Governor Walsh said after I'd finished my presentation, flipping through pages of charts and data analysis with the focused attention of someone who understood both the technical details and the political implications. The violations appear well documented and serious. If accurate, they represent exactly the kind of corporate environmental fraud that our administration has committed to prosecuting aggressively. However, Margaret Chen added, and that single word carried the weight of political reality, crushing idealistic hopes. The personal allegations complicate our ability to pursue prosecution based on your investigation alone. Defense attorneys would immediately attack your credibility as an investigator, claiming that family bias compromised your professional judgment, which means we need independent verification of your findings before proceeding with any enforcement actions. Governor Walsh concluded, we'll be commissioning a separate environmental assessment by federal investigators who have no personal connection to Sterling Industries or its executive. The words felt like watching a perfect case dissolve into bureaucratic delay tactics that could protect Sterling Industries for months or years while they continued violating environmental. Independent federal investigations could take years to complete, during which time Sterling could finish their current projects and potentially start new ones based on the same fraudulent environmental assessments. How long will an independent investigation take? I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be longer than the environmental damage could wait. 18 months to 2 years for a comprehensive review. Margaret replied, federal environmental investigations are thorough but necessarily slow. Sterling Industries will be notified that they're under investigation, which will prevent them from beginning new projects, but won't stop current construction that's already permitted. And during those 18 months, Victoria Sterling will have time to prepare defenses, destroy evidence, and potentially flee the jurisdiction if criminal charges become likely, I said, understanding suddenly that Victoria's strategy had been more sophisticated than personal character assassination. She'd created conditions that would delay justice long enough for her to escape meaningful consequences. That's not necessarily accurate, Governor Walsh said, but her tone suggested it wasn't necessarily inaccurate either. Federal investigations have resources and authority that state reviews don't possess. If violations exist, they'll be discovered and prosecuted appropriately. But as our meeting continued for another hour, covering procedural details and timeline estimates, and bureaucratic requirements that seemed designed to insulate institutions against individual initiative, I began to understand that Victoria had calculated exactly how to neutralize my investigation without directly denying the environmental violation. She'd transformed a clear case of corporate environmental fraud into a complex political problem involving personal allegations, family dynamics, and investigative credibility that would require months of additional review before any meaningful action could be taken. The most frustrating aspect was that my environmental evidence remained accurate and comprehensive regardless of personal family relationships. Sterling Industries had committed federal environmental crimes that threatened Portland's ecological future, and those crimes were documented with scientific precision that couldn't be refuted through character assassination or personal attack. But Victoria had successfully shifted the focus from environmental violations to investigative bias, creating procedural obstacles that could protect her company for years, while environmental damage continued. As I left the governor's office with promises of future communication and assurances about federal investigation procedures, I felt the weight of institutional limitations that protected corporate interests through complexity and delay rather than direct corruption. Governor Walsh genuinely wanted to pursue environmental justice, and Margaret Chen clearly understood the legal implications of Sterling's violation. But they were constrained by political realities that required absolute certainty before challenging powerful corporate interests, and Victoria had introduced just enough uncertainty about my motives to prevent immediate action. The marble steps of the state capitol felt steeper on the way down, as if gravity had strengthened while I'd been inside learning how justice could be delayed through strategic personal destruction. My phone had been buzzing throughout the meeting with messages I hadn't been able to check, and as I reached the sidewalk I finally looked at the screen to discover that my morning had become significantly more complicated while I'd been presenting evidence to officials who weren't sure they could act on it. 7 missed calls from Tash, 12 text messages from Carmen, and 1 voicemail from a number I didn't recognize but that made my stomach drop as soon as I heard the voice. Ms. Brennan, this is Marcus Hartwell, CEO of Sterling Industries. I believe we need to have a conversation about your recent activities and their potential impact on your future career prospects. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Victoria's strategy was escalating beyond character assassination into direct corporate intimidation. The invisible stepdaughter who'd been cooking Thanksgiving dinner alone while the family celebrated in the next room was about to discover that some battles couldn't be won through proper institutional channels, and that sometimes justice required tactics that institutions couldn't officially endorse, but couldn't officially condemn. As I walked toward my car planning my next move in a conflict that had outgrown environmental compliance review and become something approaching corporate warfare, my phone rang with a call from a number I recognized but had never expected to see on my caller ID. Governor Patricia Walsh was calling my personal cell phone, not through official channels or staff intermediaries, but directly.
Brennan, her voice carried an urgency that had been carefully controlled during our official meeting. I need to speak with you off the record about options that weren't appropriate to discuss in my office. Are you available for an unofficial conversation this afternoon? The question felt like an invitation into the kind of political gray area where real environmental protection happened, beyond bureaucratic procedures and institutional limitations that protected corporate interests through delay and complexity. Governor Walsh was offering something that sounded like actual action rather than more process. And after watching Victoria's strategy unfold with surgical precision, I was ready to explore options that didn't depend on systems she'd already learned to manipulate. "I'm available," I said, understanding that my environmental investigation had crossed some threshold where normal rules no longer applied, and different kinds of power would determine whether Sterling Industries faced meaningful consequences for years of systematic environmental fraud. The battle for Portland's environmental future was about to become more personal and more dangerous than anything I'd imagined when I first opened that manila folder 3 weeks ago. Whatever Governor Walsh wanted to discuss off the record, whatever options she couldn't mention in official meetings, whatever tactics fell outside normal institutional procedures, I was ready to consider them. Victoria had taught me that sometimes the only way to break a system designed to protect powerful interests was to find pressure points that system couldn't defend against. And I was about to discover exactly what pressure points a governor's office had available when institutional channels proved inadequate for environmental justice. The afternoon conversation would determine whether my Thanksgiving rebellion had been the beginning of meaningful change, or simply the first move in a much longer and more complex game where corporate power, political influence, and environmental protection intersected in ways that required strategies I'd never learned in graduate school or government training program. But for the first time since Victoria's threatening phone call Sunday evening, I felt like I might not be fighting alone against resources and connections that extended far beyond what any individual civil servant could match. The afternoon meeting location surprised me more than anything that had happened since this nightmare began. Instead of the governor's mansion or another state building, Governor Walsh had asked me to meet her at Powell's Books on Burnside, specifically in the environmental science section on the third floor. The choice felt deliberately casual, like the kind of encounter that could be explained as coincidental if anyone asked uncomfortable questions later. She was already there when I arrived, browsing through a book about climate change policy while wearing jeans and a jacket that made her look more like a concerned citizen than the state's chief executive. The transformation was so complete that I almost walked past her, expecting the formal business attire and carefully styled appearance that defined her public image. "Brennan," she said quietly, closing the book and turning toward a corner where tall shelves created natural privacy from other customers. "Thank you for meeting me like this. What I'm about to discuss can't happen in official channels for reasons that will become clear." I followed her deeper into the environmental science section, past displays of books about renewable energy and sustainable agriculture that felt like props in whatever unconventional political theater was about to unfold. Governor Walsh's demeanor had shifted completely from our morning meeting, trading institutional caution for something that felt more like personal urgency. "The Sterling Industries situation is more complicated than we discussed this morning," she began, glancing around to ensure our conversation remained private. "Victoria Sterling isn't just a corporate executive who's been falsifying environmental data. She's been operating a systematic influence network that includes state legislators, regulatory officials, and federal environmental administrators." The words hit like discovering that a simple burglary had actually been part of an international conspiracy. Influence network. Sterling Industries has been providing consulting fees, campaign contributions, and employment opportunities to current and former government officials in exchange for favorable regulatory treatment, Governor Walsh explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your environmental investigation accidentally uncovered the tip of something much larger and more dangerous than routine corporate fraud." She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of screenshots that looked like financial records and communication logs. "We've been investigating this network for 8 months, working with federal prosecutors who are building a RICO case against multiple companies and government officials. Your Sterling Industries evidence is exactly what we needed to prove the systematic nature of their operation. But this morning you said my investigation was compromised by personal bias," I said, struggling to reconcile the governor's official position with this completely different narrative. "Because this morning we were in my office with staff members and official procedures that could be monitored or recorded," she replied. "3 people in my administration have financial connections to Sterling Industries that we only discovered last week. Until we know exactly who's compromised, we have to assume that any official investigation will be leaked to Victoria before we can act on it." The paranoia was staggering, but it explained the careful neutrality of our morning meeting and the elaborate character assassination Victoria had prepared. So the delayed federal investigation, the concerns about my credibility, the need for independent verification, all necessary theater to protect the real investigation while preventing Victoria from realizing how much we actually know. Governor Walsh confirmed, "Your evidence is solid, your methodology is unquestionable, and your personal relationship to Victoria Sterling makes you the perfect witness to testify about systematic environmental fraud. Then why meet like this? Why not proceed through normal channels if you have federal prosecutors building a case?" Governor Walsh's expression darkened in a way that suggested the answer involved complications I wasn't prepared for. "Because yesterday evening Marcus Hartwell contacted federal prosecutors directly and provided them with detailed allegations about your mental health, family conflicts, and potential criminal behavior related to accessing confidential Sterling Industries documents. The revelation felt like watching a perfectly constructed building collapse in slow motion. Criminal behavior. Hartwell claims you illegally obtained internal Sterling Industries documents through your stepmother's personal computer, that you violated privacy laws and potentially committed identity theft in pursuit of personal revenge," the governor explained. "The allegations are false, but they're detailed enough to trigger federal investigation protocols that could delay prosecution for years. But I never accessed Victoria's computer. I never saw any internal Sterling Industries document. Everything in my report came from public records and independent testing data. I know that. Federal prosecutors know that. But Hartwell has provided what appears to be digital evidence of unauthorized access to Sterling Industries systems from IP addresses associated with your apartment and your father's house," Governor Walsh said grimly. "The evidence is fabricated, but proving fabrication will require digital forensics analysis that could take months." The sophistication of Victoria's counter-strategy was breathtaking. She'd anticipated not just state environmental investigation but federal criminal prosecution, preparing fabricated evidence of cyber crimes that could criminalize my legitimate environmental analysis while positioning herself as the victim of illegal corporate espionage. So we're back to bureaucratic delay while Sterling Industries continues violating environmental laws and potentially destroys evidence of their larger influence network, I said, feeling the weight of institutional limitations that protected corporate power through complexity and false allegations. "Not necessarily," Governor Walsh replied, and something in her tone suggested we'd reached the actual purpose of our unconventional meeting. "There are options outside normal prosecutorial channels, strategies that don't depend on federal investigation timelines or fabricated cybercrime allegations." She paused, looking around the bookstore one more time before continuing. "Tomorrow morning, I'm scheduled to deliver the keynote address at the Pacific Northwest Environmental Leadership Conference. 300 environmental scientists, policy advocates, and media representatives from across the region. The speech was supposed to focus on administrative policy initiatives and legislative priorities, but you're considering discussing Sterling Industries instead. I'm considering presenting your environmental evidence directly to the scientific community and environmental advocacy organizations, bypassing bureaucratic procedures that have been compromised by corporate influence," she said. "Public disclosure that makes it impossible for federal prosecutors to ignore or delay, media coverage that exposes the influence network before they can destroy evidence or flee jurisdiction." The strategy was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. By presenting my evidence at a major environmental conference, Governor Walsh could create public pressure that forced immediate federal action while exposing Sterling Industries' systematic fraud to scientists and advocates who would demand accountability regardless of bureaucratic delay tactics. "What would that mean for federal prosecution?" "For the RICO investigation you mentioned, it would accelerate everything," she replied. "Federal prosecutors would be forced to act immediately rather than conducting years of careful investigation. Sterling Industries would face public scrutiny that makes quiet settlements impossible. The influence network would be exposed before they could coordinate defensive strategies." "And what would it mean for you politically, for your administration?" Governor Walsh smiled with the kind of grim determination that had made her legendary in environmental advocacy circles. "It would probably end my political career. Governors don't usually bypass federal prosecutors and expose ongoing criminal investigations to public scrutiny, but sometimes environmental protection requires risks that political careers can't survive." The weight of her offer settled slowly. Governor Walsh was willing to sacrifice her political future to ensure that Sterling Industries faced immediate consequences for environmental fraud, that Victoria's influence network couldn't delay justice through fabricated cybercrime allegations and bureaucratic manipulation. She was offering to weaponize her platform as governor to expose corporate environmental crimes that normal institutional channels couldn't address effectively. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said, pulling out a different document that looked like legal paperwork. "This morning, Sterling Industries filed for bankruptcy protection, claiming financial difficulties related to current economic conditions. It's a defensive strategy designed to protect corporate assets from environmental liability judgment. They're trying to escape financial responsibility for environmental damage by claiming poverty." "Exactly, but bankruptcy protection only applies to civil penalties, not criminal prosecution. If we can prove systematic environmental fraud quickly enough, corporate executives still face potential prison sentences, regardless of bankruptcy status." The timeline was accelerating beyond anything I'd anticipated. Victoria wasn't just trying to delay my investigation until it became irrelevant. She was implementing exit strategies designed to protect Sterling Industries' assets and potentially allow key executives to escape meaningful consequences for years of environmental crimes. "What do you need from me?" I asked, understanding that Governor Walsh's offer represented the only realistic path toward timely environmental justice. "Your permission to present your evidence publicly tomorrow morning, and your willingness to testify at the conference about Sterling Industries' systematic environmental fraud," she replied. "Federal prosecutors will be in the audience, along with environmental scientists who can verify your methodology, and media representatives who can ensure the story receives national attention. Victoria will claim that public disclosure proves personal bias and vindictive motivation." Victoria will be arrested Wednesday morning on federal charges of environmental fraud, conspiracy and obstruction of justice, Governor Walsh said with quiet satisfaction. Along with Marcus Hartwell and approximately 12 other corporate executives and government officials who've been participating in their influence network, the scope of coordinated action was staggering. Wednesday morning, less than 48 hours from now, Victoria would discover that her years of systematic environmental fraud and corporate influence peddling had finally attracted the attention of federal prosecutors with resources and authority to pursue criminal charges regardless of fabricated cybercrime allegations or character assassination strategy. The bankruptcy filing was actually their final mistake, Governor Walsh explained. It triggered federal financial investigation protocols that exposed money laundering operations they'd been using to fund their influence network. Federal prosecutors now have comprehensive evidence of systematic criminal enterprise that goes far beyond environmental fraud, so my environmental investigation became the thread that unraveled a much larger criminal conspiracy. Your environmental investigation provided the scientific evidence that federal prosecutors needed to prove systematic fraud, rather than isolated procedural violations. She confirmed. Without your documentation of falsified water quality data and fabricated wetland assessments, they would have been limited to financial crimes that carry lighter sentences and fewer consequences. As we concluded our conversation and prepared to leave Powell's books through separate exits, I felt the surreal sensation of having stumbled into a political thriller where environmental protection intersected with organized crime and federal investigation in ways that exceeded anything I'd learned in graduate school or government training program. Tomorrow morning, Governor Walsh would present my evidence to the Pacific Northwest Environmental Leadership Conference, exposing Sterling Industries' systematic environmental fraud to hundreds of scientists and advocates who would ensure the story received the attention it deserved. Wednesday morning, Victoria would be arrested on federal charges that could result in decades of prison time and complete destruction of the influence network she'd spent years building. The invisible stepdaughter who'd been cooking Thanksgiving dinner alone while the family celebrated in the next room, had accidentally uncovered criminal enterprise that threatened environmental protection across the entire Pacific Northwest region. Victoria's strategy of treating me like disposable domestic help while building her corporate reputation had been the biggest miscalculation of her criminal career. As I drove home through Portland streets that looked different somehow, as if discovering the scope of environmental crimes being committed had changed the city's fundamental character, I thought about the 20-pound turkey still sitting in the Lake Oswego refrigerator. Victoria had probably thrown it away by now, along with any pretense that family relationships mattered more than criminal liability and federal prosecution. My phone buzzed with a text from Tash asking about my mysterious afternoon meeting and whether I needed emotional support for whatever bureaucratic nightmare was unfolding. I smiled as I typed back a response that felt like the understatement of the decade. Things are about to get interesting. Turn on the news Wednesday morning. Wednesday morning, Victoria Sterling would wake up in federal custody facing charges that could result in 20 years in federal prison and financial penalties that would bankrupt Sterling Industries completely. The influence network that had protected environmental criminals for years would be exposed and prosecuted, potentially changing how environmental compliance was enforced across multiple states. And I would wake up in my own apartment, no longer the invisible family member whose existence was optional and whose contributions went unacknowledged. I'd become the environmental analyst whose investigation had exposed systematic criminal enterprise, whose evidence had enabled federal prosecutors to pursue justice that normal bureaucratic channels couldn't deliver. The transformation felt complete in ways that went far beyond professional recognition or family vindication. Victoria had taught me to be invisible, but she'd forgotten that invisible people see everything, and sometimes they have the power to make what they've seen matter in ways that change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.